Ruth Davidson, welcome very warmly. Ruth Davidson, the government has missed its target on borrowing, it's missed its target on the deficit, it's missed its target on debt. This is a picture of economic failure, isn't it?
Well, you've just heard from Paul Johnson there that debt interest is no higher than it was, that we've brought down borrowing to its lowest levels in decades, from its highest levels post-war, that we're two-thirds of the way through cutting the deficit, that we're on target for greater growth, and that one of the underlying issues that we have about growth in this country has been productivity, and that's something that this budget has sought to address as well.
OK, well, let's start with what we were promised as a country by your party in 2010, which was that the deficit would be eliminated in 2015. Can you remind us when the deficit will be eliminated? Well,
look, we're bringing it down. Like I say, we're more than two-thirds of the way through that process. That's not just because of the hard work of the government. It's through the hard work of people that are going out to work every single day in this country. What we're trying to do is ensure that we've got a balanced economy, so we can't be criticised for cutting too much on the one hand, but not bringing down borrowing so much on the other. So it's about trying to find that balanced way forward, and I think that's broadly what we've done.
Right, you didn't answer my question. The answer is, on the current figures, by 2031, that's 16 years of extra indebtedness. A toddler watching this programme, struggling with the remote control, trying to turn over to CBBC, will be a voter by the time this is...
Turn over to where, Andrew?
Sorry? Turn over to CBBC.
Right, OK.
Teletubbies, all that stuff. That toddler will be a mature voter taking part in an election before this deficit is dealt with. That is a massive, massive failure by your government.
Well, look, the deficit was run up before we came to office. We've been bringing it down over time in a sustained and stable way. We're making sure that, as your previous independent advisor that's just been on the show has said, that we've been doing that at a time of low interest rates. So the debt interest is not any higher than it was around 10 years ago. We're making sure that we're building for the long term. So we've got investment in infrastructure. We've got investment in productivity. We're building Britain for the future, making sure we've got the housing that we need, the investment in skills that we need.
Ruth
These
Davidson,
are all long-term positions that'll carry us through forward.
Those sound great words, but you said just a couple of years ago that by 2020 we'd be in surplus. There is going to be a £35 billion deficit then. That's a terrible failure.
Well, look, what we're saying is we're bringing down the deficit that we inherited. We're trying to do that in a sustainable way. Now, we've got the Labour Party. You've had Barry Gardiner just on, who I think gave an extraordinary interview where he said that the Chancellor just had a very good budget, that he couldn't tell you what Labour's plans were on the economy. He couldn't tell you what Labour's plans were on Brexit. He couldn't tell you what their options were. Well, we inherited a mess from a government that didn't know what they were doing. We've been sustainably bringing it down over time. We're not charging the country any extra. We're bringing it down. We're getting over the hump this year of the debt to GDP ratio. This is the key year for that. We had the second fastest growing economy of major developed economies in the world last year. We're investing in the long term in R&D, we're investing in infrastructure, we're investing in skills so that we can have future sustained growth. These are all positives.
Well, I'm delighted that you're going to answer some of my questions on Brexit because I was worried about that. But before I do, let me remind you what Philip Hammond said in his first budget. He said, "It's a privilege to report today on an economy which the IFF predicts will be the fastest growing major advanced economy in the world this year." Where are we now?
Well, last year's we were the second fastest, so we were one off.
Where are we now?
Well, we've seen that those have been revised downwards. Now, that's disappointing, but we have consistently broken some of the
we're joint with Portugal right at the bottom. We're right at the bottom of that table with Portugal.
The last year that we had actual numbers for, not forecasts, not people that are trying to do futurology, but where we actually had numbers, were for last year, for 2016, we were the second fastest growing major developed economy in the world. Now,
you talked earlier on, you used the P word, productivity, which is indeed underlies all of this. But productivity was something that has been a problem in this economy for a very, very long time. And in every budget between 2010 and 2015, the word wasn't even mentioned. Surely the Conservatives have been asleep at the wheel when it comes to getting productivity in this country back up again.
Well, it's been a problem since before then too, and I don't think you saw either Alistair Darling or before him Gordon Brown mentioning it. But there's lots of things that can help with that, and some of the really key ones that Philip Hammond, I think quite rightly, put in his budget this year is to look at skills training, which is to look at some of the T levels that are going on in England. Obviously, we don't have those in Scotland, but technical education. To look at infrastructure, so we're able to support businesses, to support growth, to invest in R&D to a greater level, so that we're able to bring new technologies to help solve the productivity crisis. And I think also long-term investment. And Paul Johnson, who was your IFS contributor just a moment ago,
so
in his immediate reaction to the budget, and let me just get this one out, because this is quite important for people
Get it
at
out
home.
quickly, if you wouldn't mind.
Sorry, he said that we're headed for 2.4% of our GDP to be put into long-term investment. Now, that's the highest level for 40 years. Now, even he said that that was remarkable at a time when there's been been great restrictions on the budget, and that shows that there's a real long-term commitment here to building a Britain's future that can be successful going forward.
OK, lots of big abstract words, productivity and investment and so forth, but for an awful lot of people watching, what really matters, and you've made this point yourself, particularly for people at the bottom of the heap, as it were, is real wages. People going out, working their socks off day after day, week after week. And real wages are going to carry on falling until 2025. That surely changes the entire political context of this country.
Well, we've been making sure that the people who are on the lower wages have been having the biggest rises. That's why there's been a rise in the national minimum wage. It's why there's a rise in the national living wage. It's why we've moved the threshold for when you start paying tax. So your take-home pay, the bit that you actually hold in your hand yourself, is higher than before. And somebody who's a full-time worker on the national living wage is now £2,000 a year better off than they were in 2010. So that's a real difference. It's about 7% above the way in which inflation has been rising. So the people on the lower incomes have had the best return, if you like. Now, I know it's tough. I know it's tough.
And it's going to be tough for a very long time, isn't it? It's going to be tough for a long time to come.
But that's why we're doing more in terms of making sure the wages themselves rise, but also we take less of it back in tax.
Let me turn to Brexit, because as we were saying on the show earlier on, there is now a very clear choice in front of the country. It's a kind of existential choice. The Irish EU Commissioner, the Taoiseach himself, has said that he wants in writing an agreement that Northern Ireland will be part of some kind of customs union, possibly single market arrangement, so there does not have to be any kind of hard border between the north and the south in Ireland. And on the other side, the DUP, on which your party in Parliament down south depends, has made it absolutely clear that they will not put up with that. Now, if there's one thing we know about you, it's that you're a unionist. So what is your view of the situation? On which side of the fence do we have to jump?
Well, I think it's a false dichotomy. I think that the Prime Minister has made it absolutely clear in her Florence speech that she doesn't want to see a return to borders of the past. She doesn't want physical infrastructure between North and the Republic of Ireland, and she's right to say that. But nor do we want to see, and nor should we see, anything that impacts on the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom as a nation.
I'm going to jump into that and ask you for a solution, because it's not a false dichotomy. If there is if Northern Ireland is in one situation with the customs union and the single market, and the south is still part of those things, there has to be some kind of border, and nobody has explained how that will be avoided. So it's not a false dichotomy, it is a real hard choice which has to be made by the government within the next 2 weeks. Which side are you on?
Well, look, this is all subject to negotiation. As you say, we've got 2 weeks in which it's going to get pretty tousy. It's going to get pretty tough in that negotiating room. It doesn't require commentators from outside cabinet, outside government like myself, to try and commit the UK government to one side or the other. And I'm not going to do that on your programme. So I'm sorry to disappoint you.
If I may say so, you're behaving exactly like Barry Gardiner. You're doing a Barry Gardiner, Ruth Davidson.
Well, do you know, I've had plenty of insults thrown at me before, but I'm not sure that one's going to stick. I don't think me and Barry are really from the same political tribe.
I know.
However, what I am going to go on to say...
You attacked him for dodging this question, you're dodging it too.
Well, if you would let me go on to say that we know that this is one of the really difficult nitty-gritty bits of the negotiation, and we understand that. But what we've been positing to the European Union is that we don't have to have something that's an off-the-shelf solution, because we are a different case to any other country that interacts with the EU. And let me explain why that is. You know, we're not Canada, we're not Norway, we're not someone else, because we are the only country that has previously been a part of the European Union, that complies with every single rule and regulation of the European Union, that will then sit outside of it. So there are differences there. Now, I know from 10 years as a reporter before I was elected, and you know from 30-some years of reporting on European negotiations, that the people that walk up to the microphones and speak to their home audience don't always reflect the negotiation and the progress that is going on in the room. When it comes to European negotiations, it's always a 5 past midnight job. So don't think just because you've got members of the European Commission who have got, absolutely a stated position to defend, and I understand that and I accept that, that when they walk up to a microphone and they're speaking to their home audience, that necessarily reflects the progress that's going on in the room. Because we will see in 2 weeks' time whether we've got to a point where we can have this resolved.
And if we don't get it resolved in 2 weeks' time, how serious is that for the entire Brexit negotiations? Do we need to get onto the transitional deal? Do we need to get onto the trade talks with that agreement in 2 weeks?
Well, look, I think that it's really important that we get the transitional deal nailed down. That's not for the government. I think that's for businesses so they know what they're doing next year and they're able to plan. But what I do understand is that if we don't make it through in the next 2 weeks to move on to that next phase, then we are rapidly going to run out of time in terms of getting us to a good position at the time that transitional deal is supposed to take place.
So this is quite a hard deadline, in your view?
Well, it's hard in the sense that it does constrict the amount of time we've got to do things if we don't make it into the next phase. I don't think it means that the world has ended, but I do think that it's a setback.
All right, Ruth Davidson, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. Now